The day Mabel Brooks arrived in Dustwood, Texas, in the spring of 1882, she stepped off the stagecoach and directly into a horse trough, and every soul on the main street turned to watch. Every soul except Frank Graves, who was leaning against the post of the general store with his hat pulled low and his eyes somewhere far away, somewhere no one else in Dustwood could follow him. She came up sputtering, her brown hair plastered flat across her forehead, her traveling dress soaked through at the hem and clinging to her boots like it had decided to drown her before the town even got the chance. She looked around at the gawking faces, the old women on the porch of the dry goods store pressing handkerchiefs to their mouths, the ranch hand who had dropped his bag of feed, the stagecoach driver who was trying very hard not to grin, and Mabel Brooks did not cry, did not shriek, did not offer a single word of embarrassment. She stood up straight, pulled her soaking hat from her head, wrung it out with both hands the same way she might wring out a dishcloth at home, set it back on her wet hair, and walked directly toward the general store like nothing in the world had happened. That was when Frank Graves finally looked up. He had not meant to. He had been doing a fine job of not looking at anything for the better part of 3 years running, which was a particular skill he had developed after his wife Clara died of fever in the winter of 1879. He had gotten very good at looking without seeing, at being present without being there, at going through the exact motions of a man who was still alive, without doing anything that might confirm it. He ran his cattle, he paid his bills, he ate when reminded to, and he slept when he absolutely had to. The town of Dustwood had long since stopped trying to draw him out of whatever hollow place he had retreated into, and Frank had long since stopped minding that they had. But something about the sound of that splash, followed by the very particular sound of a woman decisively wringing out her hat, made him look up. And then Mabel Brooks walked past him, close enough that he could see the water dripping off the end of her nose, and she looked straight at him with dark brown eyes that were entirely unapologetic, and she said, "Well, that was a fine introduction." And she walked inside the store. Frank stared at the door she had gone through. He did not smile. He was nowhere near smiling. But something in his chest shifted, the way a heavy stone shifts when the ground beneath it settles, not moving far, but moving. And that small, almost imperceptible movement was more than anything had caused in him in a very long time. Mabel Brooks was 26 years old, a schoolteacher from Abilene who had answered an advertisement in the Abilene Chronicle that sought a qualified teacher for the growing town of Dustwood. The previous schoolteacher, a Mr. Horace Webb, had left in something of a hurry after an unfortunate incident involving the mayor's goat and a disputed game of checkers, the details of which were still debated in the saloon on slow evenings. Dustwood had 12 children of school age and no one to teach them, and the town council had been corresponding with candidates for 4 months before Mabel replied with a letter that was direct, confident, and contained not a single unnecessary word. She had taken a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Edna Clary, a stout, fast-talking woman with an opinion on everything who served biscuits at breakfast that were the size and approximate hardness of river stones. Mabel accepted the biscuits with gratitude and the opinions with grace, and set about making herself at home in a town that was still making up its mind about her. The schoolhouse was a single room at the east end of town, and it had not been swept in 2 months. Mabel arrived on her first morning with a broom, a bucket, a determined set to her jaw, and a crate of books she had brought from Abilene on the stagecoach, the same stagecoach that had deposited her in the horse trough, which she had already decided she would find funny for the rest of her life. She propped the door open to let in the warm spring air and started sweeping. "You want some help with that?" She turned around. Leaning in the doorway was a boy of about 9, gap-toothed and brown from the sun, with his hands shoved in his pockets and a look of cautious interest on his face. "What is your name?" she asked. "Billy Harlow. Can you sweep, Billy Harlow?" He shrugged. "Some." "Then yes," she said, and handed him the broom. That was how school began in Dustwood. By 9 o'clock on the first Monday morning, there were 11 children sitting on the long wooden benches. The 12th, a girl named June Pettigrew, had come down with a cold, and Mabel was standing at the front of the room with a piece of chalk in her hand, and the absolute conviction that whatever these children had missed, she was going to give them. What she had not expected was that the rancher who owned the largest cattle operation east of town would have a daughter sitting in the fourth row. Her name was Sophie Graves. She was 8 years old. She had her father's dark gray eyes and her late mother's fine, light brown hair, and she sat very still with her hands folded on her knees in the particular way of a child who has learned not to take up too much space. She answered questions quietly when called upon, and she did everything asked of her, but there was something held back in her, something shuddered that Mabel recognized immediately, because she had seen it before in children who had lost someone important. After school that first day, Mabel stayed to straighten the benches and found Sophie still sitting on hers. "Your father is coming for you," Mabel asked. "Mr. Holt is," Sophie said. "He works for my father." "And where is your father?" Sophie looked at her lap. "He is working." "Of course," Mabel said and sat down on the bench beside her. "Do you like horses, Sophie?" Sophie looked up, surprised by the change in direction. "Yes. I am terrified of them," Mabel said plainly. Sophie blinked. "Then why did you come to Texas?" "Because the advertisement did not specify that horses would be involved," Mabel said. Which, in hindsight, was something I should have considered more carefully. Sophie stared at her for a moment, and then something very small and fragile happened in the corners of her eyes, not quite a smile, but the memory of one, or perhaps the possibility of a future one. "My mother was not afraid of horses," she said. "Your mother sounds like she was very brave," Mabel said. "She was," Sophie said. And then Mr. Holt arrived, and Sophie slid off the bench and put on her hat and left. And Mabel sat alone in the afternoon quiet of the schoolhouse and thought about Gray Eyes, the little girls, and the man in the doorway of the general store. It was Edna Clary who told her about Frank Graves, because Edna Clary could not be stopped from telling people things. Over supper that first evening, with the table laid with salt pork and cornbread and the kind of beans that had been cooked long enough to have opinions, Edna folded her thick hands and launched directly into the subject. "You will have Sophie Graves in your class," she said. It was not a question. "I do," Mabel said. "Poor lamb," Edna said. "Lost her mother 3 years past. Fever. Frank Graves nearly lost himself with her." She shook her head. "He used to be a different sort of man, Frank did. Used to come into town for the dances. Used to tell a joke now and then. His laugh, Lord, that man had a laugh like a crack of thunder on a summer night. Made you feel like everything was going to be all right." She paused. "Haven't heard it since Clara passed. Haven't heard him do much of anything since, truth be told, except work himself half to death on that ranch and come into town when he absolutely must." Mabel looked at her plate. "And there is no one to look after Sophie." "He looks after her," Edna said a little sharply. "He loves that child fierce. He is just somewhere he cannot entirely get back from. You understand?" Mabel understood. She had known a grief like that from the outside, watching her own father after her mother died when Mabel was 12. She knew what it looked like when a person kept breathing even though they had quietly agreed to stop living. The first time she properly spoke to Frank Graves was 2 weeks into her time in Dustwood. She had gone to the general store to purchase chalk, because she had already used half of what she brought, and 12 children could produce a remarkable quantity of work when sufficiently motivated. She was standing at the counter explaining to Mr. Purvis, the storekeeper, that she needed the kind of chalk that did not crumble immediately on contact with the board, when the door opened and Frank Graves came in. She recognized him from her first day: the hat, the set of his shoulders, the particular way he moved that suggested he was conserving something, energy or emotion or both. He was taller than she had registered from a distance. He had dark stubble along his jaw and his hands were large and were cruffined, and he had the lean, capable look of a man who had spent 20 years doing hard physical things outdoors. Mabel estimated he was somewhere in his middle 30s. He nodded to Mr. Purvis, and placed his order without looking at Mabel, which would have been rude except that it seemed less like rudeness and more like a person who had simply gotten out of the habit of noticing people. "You are Sophie's father," Mabel said. He turned and looked at her, and she had the feeling again that he was looking directly at her but from a great distance. "Miss Brooks," he said. His voice was low, even. "Sophie said you had started." "She is doing very well," Mabel said. "She is a bright girl, careful with her work." Something moved through his expression, brief and unguarded. "She takes after her mother in that." "I imagine she takes after you in other things," Mabel said. Frank Graves looked at her for a moment, and she got the sense he was not sure what to do with that. "Thank you for teaching her," he said, and then he picked up his supplies and left. Mabel watched the door close. Mr. Purvis set her chalk on the counter and said, "That is about the most he has said to a person in a month." "Is that so?" Mabel said. "Miss Brooks," Purvis said, with the tone of a man issuing a gentle warning, "a great many people have tried to draw Frank Graves back into the world, and a great many people have given up. I would not recommend making a project of it." "I have no intention of making a project of anything," Mabel said, took her chalk and left. She thought about him anyway. She was not sure why exactly. She had not come to Dustwood looking for anything except useful work, and perhaps a fresh start after 5 years of teaching in Abilene that had felt increasingly like standing still. She had not come looking for a man, and especially not a man who carried grief around his shoulders like a coat he had forgotten he was wearing. She was practical by nature, direct by habit, and she had made herself quite comfortable with solitude over the years. But there was something about Frank Graves that had taken up residence in a corner of her mind and refused to leave, and Mabel, who was very honest with herself, acknowledged it for what it was, and then very firmly told herself to focus on teaching 12 children their multiplication tables. The spring in Dustwood moved warmly. The mesquite bloomed in pale yellow, and the air had that particular Texas smell of dry earth and new grass, and Mabel discovered that the horse trough into which she had fallen was placed in a deeply inconvenient location relative to the stage stop, and that she was not, as she had initially suspected, uniquely clumsy. 3 other people had walked into it since her arrival, though none with quite the same commitment. She saw Frank Graves perhaps once a week, usually at the store or on the main street when he came to collect Sophie. He was always civil and brief. She was civil and not particularly brief, because brevity was not always her nature, and she found she did not want to be brief with him. She asked him about the cattle. She asked him about the south pasture fence that Billy Harlow had mentioned was giving trouble. She asked him, once, whether he thought the weather would hold for the county gathering at the end of the month. He answered her questions with the same measured economy as always. But she noticed that he never cut her off and never looked away first. He listened to everything she said with a focused attention that she suspected was involuntary. Sophie, meanwhile, was beginning to emerge. It happened slowly. The way a plant begins to grow toward light it is not entirely sure it can trust. She started staying at recess instead of sitting inside. She started answering questions without being called on. She drew a picture of a horse on the inside cover of her primer that was genuinely quite good, and when Mabel told her so, she smiled a full smile, not the shadow of one, for the first time since the school term had started. Mabel told Frank about the picture the next time she saw him. They were standing outside the store in the late afternoon, Sophie just inside selecting a peppermint stick from the jar on the counter, and the light was going golden over the rooftops, and the street was quiet in the way that small towns go quiet at the end of a working day. She drew a horse, Mabel said, on the inside of her primer, which was technically against the rule I had established about keeping primers clean, but the drawing was so good that I decided to revise the rule. Frank looked at her. For just a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his gray eyes, not quite warmth, but the ember before warmth, the thing that comes right before. "She used to draw on everything when she was small," he said. "Clara said she came by it natural. Clara could draw anything." "Then Sophie has a gift from her mother," Mabel said simply. "That is something to be glad of." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, as though testing whether the words would break anything, "Yes, I suppose it is." It was the longest thing he had said to her that was not in direct answer to a question, and Mabel knew better than to press, so she only nodded and said, "Good evening, Mr. Graves," and went back to the boarding house and thought about him for the rest of the night. May turned to June, and the heat settled on Dustwood like it meant business. The children at school learned to recite their states and capitals, which was more than could be said for some adults Mabel had met. Billy Harlow, who had arrived suspicious and had gradually become something approaching a self-appointed helper, developed a facility for long division that Mabel found genuinely impressive. Sophie Graves had begun staying after school not because she was waiting for Mr. Holt but because she liked to talk to Mabel, and their conversations ranged from horses to arithmetic to what the stars were called to whether a person could train a dog to do arithmetic, a question Mabel could not answer with certainty. One afternoon in early June, Frank Graves himself came to collect Sophie instead of Mr. Holt. He stood in the doorway in much the same posture as he had that first day at the general store, hat in hand this time, waiting while Sophie finished copying a passage from the reader. Mabel was at her desk reviewing papers, and she became aware of him standing there with the particular awareness that a person develops when someone they are thinking about appears in their vicinity. "She will only be a moment," Mabel said without looking up. "No hurry," Frank said. There was a comfortable quiet for a while, broken only by Sophie's pencil moving. Then Frank said, "She talks about your class." Mabel looked up. "Good things, I hope." "Hasn't complained once," he said, and this was apparently meant as high praise. "She used to complain about old Webb every single day." "I heard about Mr. Webb," Mabel said. "And the goat." The corner of Frank's mouth moved. It was the closest thing to an expression of amusement she had seen from him. "The goat was named Gerald," he said. "That does make it funnier somehow," Mabel said. He looked down at his hat for a moment. "Sophie says you are afraid of horses." "Profoundly," Mabel said. "You live in Texas." "I do," she agreed. "I try not to hold it against the horses." He looked at her again, and this time she was certain she saw it, just the very beginning of something around the edges of his expression, a tightening in the lines around his eyes that might have been the ancestor of a smile. "That is very magnanimous of you," he said, and his voice had a different quality to it, just for those words, something drier and more present. "I think about it that way," Mabel said. "There are many things in Texas that are very large and very capable of causing harm, and since I have moved here and cannot easily change that situation, it seems best to simply not be angry about it." He was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read. Sophie slid off the bench and came to the front of the room, and Frank settled his hat back on his head and moved back from the doorway. "Good evening, Miss Brooks," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Graves," she said. Sophie waved at her from beside her father, and they walked out into the evening, and Mabel sat for a long time after they left, looking at nothing in particular, with a warmth in her chest that she was starting to find very difficult to argue with. She argued with it anyway. She was a practical woman with a position she had only just secured and a school that needed her full attention. She was not here for anything except to do good work. She said all of this to herself very firmly and with great conviction, and then went back to reviewing her papers. The county social at the end of June was held on a Saturday evening at the Dustwood Town Hall, which was a generous name for a building that was slightly larger than most barns and smelled faintly of sawdust and horse. But it had a fiddle player named Collins who could make a real go until your legs gave out, and 3 tables of food that the women of the town had contributed to with considerable competition, and the lanterns strung between the posts gave everything a soft gold light that made even Dustwood look a little like a painting. Mabel had been told firmly by Edna Clary that attendance was not optional. She wore her blue dress, which was the better of the 2 she owned, and she put her hair up, which she did not always bother with, and she arrived to find the hall already full of the entire working population of Dustwood and its surrounding ranches. She knew most of them by now, at least by name. There was the mayor, Aldous Fenwick, a round man with a magnificent white mustache who had been campaigning for an extension to the water supply for 2 years. There was Hector Salinas, who ran the livery stable with quiet competence and whose wife Rosa made the best tamales in the county. There were the Harlow brothers, both of them substantial men who farmed wheat east of town, and there was Billy Harlow at the edge of the room looking self-conscious, because his mother had made him put on his good shirt. Mabel had been there perhaps 20 minutes and was in conversation with Rosa Salinas about the tamales which were on the table, and which Mabel was already committed to eating as many of as possible, when Sophie Graves appeared at her elbow. "Miss Brooks," Sophie said with the seriousness of a person delivering important information, "my father is outside." "Outside," Mabel said. "He does not like it in here," Sophie said simply. "He used to, but now he stands outside." Mabel looked at the door. Then she looked at Sophie, whose gray eyes were very direct. "Does he know you came to tell me this?" Mabel asked. Sophie considered this. "No," she said, with a small, entirely innocent expression. Mabel excused herself from Rosa and her tamales and went outside. Frank was standing at the edge of the lamplight, on the far side of the hall where the porch wrapped around to the side, leaning against the railing and looking out at the dark spread of the Texas night above the rooftops. There were stars out in a quantity that still startled Mabel, having come from a town with more oil lamps and fewer clear skies. The night was warm and carried the smell of grass and something that might have been distant rain. He heard her come around the corner and turned, and for just a moment, before his expression settled back into its habitual reserve, she caught something that looked like relief, as though he had not known he was hoping someone would come and find him, but had been hoping for it nonetheless. "Sophie told me where you were," she said, before he could say anything else. "Did she?" he said, in a tone that suggested he was not entirely surprised. "She is very fond of you," Mabel said. "She worries." He turned back to the stars. "She shouldn't." "Children always worry about the people they love," Mabel said. "You cannot stop them. It is built into the construction." He was quiet for a moment. The music from inside drifted out to them, the fiddle going through a quick reel. "I used to dance," he said, and he did not say it with sentiment, more with the detachment of a man reporting a historical fact. "Clara and I danced at every one of these. She liked to dance." "What else did she like?" Mabel asked, and she asked it gently, not as a probe but as a real question, the kind that wanted a real answer. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "She liked the rain." She would stand on the porch when it started every time, no matter what she was doing. She liked to read. She ordered books from a catalog in St. Louis. She liked to argue about things she cared about. A pause. "She was better at it than me. Better at most things, truth be told." "She sounds like she was wonderful," Mabel said. "She was," Frank said, "and there was no performance in it, no particular sorrow or anger, just the plain fact of it." They stood in the quiet for a little while, and the stars were very bright, and the reel inside came to an end. "Do you think," Mabel said carefully, "that she would want you to stand outside for the rest of your life?" He turned and looked at her, and for a second she thought she had misjudged it, had moved too far too fast. But he only looked at her steadily, the way he always looked at her from that careful distance. "No," he said. "She would have words for me about it. Strong words, I imagine." "Very strong words," he agreed, and again there was that almost quality in his expression, the thing that was the shape of amusement without quite committing to it. Mabel said, "I am going back inside to eat an irresponsible quantity of Rosa Salinas's tamales. You are welcome to come or stay, as you please." And then she went back inside, and she did not look over her shoulder to see if he followed. He came inside about 10 minutes later. He stood at the edge of the room with a glass of something in his hand, and he did not dance and he did not stay long, but he came inside, and Sophie, who had been watching the door from the other side of the room, lit up like the 4th of July. Mabel noticed this and pretended not to. July brought the hard heat and also brought trouble, as July in the Texas border country sometimes did. A man named Cord Bellamy, who ran cattle on the western range and had a reputation for stretching the idea of property lines, had been pushing his herd onto the eastern pasture that bordered Frank Graves's land, and Frank had been tolerating it with the particular patience of a man who has more important things to put his energy into. But at the beginning of July, 3 of Frank's calves disappeared, and the hands came back saying they had seen them in Bellamy's herd on the wrong side of the fence line. Mabel heard about this from Edna, who heard it from the livery man, who heard it from one of Frank's ranch hands. She did not know why this information caused her a particular tension that made her focus poorly on the lesson plan she was revising, but it did, and she acknowledged it with the same honesty she applied to all her uncomfortable recognitions. She saw Frank 2 days after that, in the late afternoon, coming out of the sheriff's office on the main street. He looked as he always looked from a distance, measured and contained, but as she drew close, she could see the tightness around his jaw that said something else. "I heard about the calves," she said. "I am sorry about it." "It'll be sorted," he said. "Will the sheriff help?" "Sheriff Hobart is a good man who is careful about his jurisdiction," Frank said, which was a polite way of saying the sheriff was not rushing to act. "It'll be sorted," he said again, quieter, and she understood that this was not a boast but a resolution, the kind a man makes when he intends to handle something himself. "Please be careful," Mabel said. She said it plainly, without fuss, just the words as she meant them. He looked at her. Something in the long quiet between them felt like it was shifting again, that stone moving under its own weight. "I will be," he said, and she believed him. The matter with Bellamy was settled 2 weeks later when Frank produced witnesses and a proper survey of the fence line to both the sheriff and the county office in the nearest town of size, and Bellamy, faced with written evidence and 2 credible men willing to testify, backed down. The calves were returned. There was no violence, which Mabel was glad of when she heard it, though she had not been certain there would not be. The following Saturday, Frank came to the school. It was a Saturday morning, and school was not in session, and Mabel was there alone, reorganizing the reading materials on the shelves she had put up in June. She had her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming loose from its arrangement because she had been reaching over her head, and she was also, at the particular moment he appeared in the doorway, standing on the second highest rung of the step ladder, muttering something under her breath about the shelf being 3 inches higher than any reasonable person would build a shelf. "Miss Brooks," he said. She startled, grabbed the shelf for balance, and then looked over her shoulder. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and he had a look on his face that was less guarded than usual, as though coming here on a Saturday had required some private decision and the decision had left its traces. "Mr. Graves," she said, and descended the ladder with as much dignity as possible. "I was not expecting anyone. I should have sent word," he said. "No, no," she said, rolling her sleeves back down. "Come in." He came in, and he looked around the schoolroom the way a person looks around a place that belongs to someone else, taking in the primers and the map on the wall, and the drawings Sophie had made that were now pinned above the window. He looked at those for a moment. "I came to thank you," he said, "for Sophie. She is different this summer than she was last year. She talks more, she laughs more." He paused. "You did that." "She did that," Mabel said. "She was ready, I just kept the door open." "Well," he turned the brim of his hat in his hands. "It matters, more than I can." He stopped and started again. "I wanted you to know it matters." Mabel looked at him and felt something enormous and quiet moving through her. "I know," she said. He nodded once, set his hat back on his head, and then, instead of leaving, he said, "Sophie also told me you have been going over to the Salinas' corral on Tuesdays." Mabel blinked. "Has she?" "She says Hector has been letting you get used to the horses." "I have a professional obligation," Mabel said, "to not be demonstrably afraid of the most common animal in my students' daily lives. Also, I walk past that corral every day and the bay mare has begun to recognize me, which felt like a social commitment I was obligated to honor. The corner of his mouth moved again. Hector is a good man with horses, but if you wanted, he said carefully, I could show you. I have a mare who is older, steady, patient with beginners. Sophie learned on her. Mabel looked at him for a long moment. Are you offering to teach me to ride, Mr. Graves? I'm offering to let you stand near a horse without falling down, he said. We can work up to riding if you survive the standing. And something happened in his eyes when he said that, just a flicker, just the tiniest pull at the corner of his expression, and Mabel felt the warmth she had been trying very reasonably to talk herself out of for the past 2 months take up twice the space it had occupied before. All right, she said. They arranged it for the following Thursday after school, when Sophie would ride along and Frank would bring Mabel out to the Graves ranch. Mabel spent the preceding days being very reasonable about this arrangement and telling herself it was simply a practical solution to a practical problem, and not, in any way, a reason to think about Frank Graves substantially more than she already did, which was already more than she had intended. She was, it should be noted, entirely unsuccessful at this. The Graves ranch was 4 miles east of town, and the ride out was Mabel's first time on horseback, which Frank had arranged very carefully, putting her on a small gray he used to haul supplies rather than the mare he had mentioned, on the grounds that the gray was extraordinarily lazy and unlikely to do anything alarming. Sophie rode beside her on her own pony and provided a running commentary on everything they passed, the name of every feature of the landscape, which rock formation looked like what, where the best jackrabbit runs were, and a detailed account of the time a coyote had gotten into the chicken coop and what had subsequently happened to the coyote. Frank rode on her other side, quiet, occasionally saying a word about how to hold the reins or when to adjust her seat, and every time she did something right he said so with one brief word, good, or there. And those small words had a quality of attention that she felt in an unreasonable place somewhere in the region of her ribs. The ranch was beautiful. She had not expected it to be beautiful, or rather she had not thought about it, but the house was a good solid adobe and timber structure that stood at the top of a gentle rise with a view of the whole south pasture and the line of mesquite along the creek, and in the afternoon light everything was the color of gold and sage and the pale blue of the Texas sky. It looked like a place that had been tended and loved, even through the years of going through motions. She stood near the mare that Frank led out, a dun-colored animal named Patience, a name that Mabel found immensely reassuring, and did not fall down, and she touched the animal's nose with the flat of her hand and Patience blinked at her with large, liquid eyes that suggested deep personal indifference. She doesn't care about you at all, Frank said beside her. I find that comforting, Mabel said. Most people prefer the horse to like them. I will work up to wanting to be liked by a horse, Mabel said. Right now I am simply pleased that she has no opinion about me. He made a sound. It was a very small sound, almost nothing, somewhere between an exhale and a syllable. But it came from the back of his throat and had the shape of amusement, and Mabel looked at him sideways and saw that he was looking down at Patience's neck with something on his face that was not quite a smile, but was closer to one than anything she had seen from him before. She filed it away and said nothing, and let it be what it was. Sophie fell asleep on the ride home, drooping sideways on her pony in the way that children fall asleep completely, and without apparent concern for the physics of the situation. Frank rode over and steadied her gently, and Mabel watched him do it, the easy, careful way he reached over to keep his daughter upright in the saddle without waking her, and she thought she had perhaps never seen anything more quietly beautiful in her life. He caught her looking. For a moment they both were simply there, the sleeping child between them and the wide evening sky above, and neither of them said anything. Then Mabel looked forward at the road and thought, with absolute clarity, that she was thoroughly, irretrievably in love with Frank Graves, and she was not even particularly surprised by it. She did not tell him this. She was honest with herself, but she was not reckless, and she understood, from everything she had seen and heard, and from the way he was still wearing his grief like something structural, that this was not the time for declarations. So she said nothing and let him ride Sophie home, and then ride back to accompany Mabel the rest of the way to town. And when they reached the boarding house, he helped her down from the gray and his hands were at her waist for just a moment, steadying her. And she stepped down onto the earth and looked up at him and said, "Thank you, Mr. Graves." And he said, "Frank," very quietly, as though the word had come out without his having entirely authorized it. She smiled. "Thank you, Frank." And she went inside and she stood in the hallway for a full minute just standing there. And then Edna came out of the kitchen wanting to know about supper, and the moment dissolved. August was hot and slow, and the school term continued, and Frank came on Thursdays with Sophie. And what had started as a practical arrangement about horses became something else, or revealed itself to have been something else from the beginning. After the first 2 Thursdays, when Sophie began staying at the house with old Mrs. Reyes, who cooked and kept house for Frank and who had essentially appointed herself Sophie's grandmother, Frank and Mabel would take the horses out alone in the late afternoon. They talked. This was the thing that surprised Mabel most, not that he was capable of conversation, because she had always suspected he was, but the quality of it. Frank Graves was a man who had thoughts about things, real thoughts, examined and specific. And once the habit of silence began to loosen, he had things to say that were worth hearing. He had views about the cattle business and about water rights and about the future of the territory, which was only 2 years away from incorporating as proper state. He had read more than she had expected. He had opinions about novels, had read several of Dickens and thought the man wrote too long, which made Mabel laugh. "He does write too long," she said, "but he earns it." Clara thought so too, Frank said, and it came out easily, not with the careful weight it had carried before. He was beginning to speak of Clara in the past tense without the past tense costing him something visible each time. "What did she think of Dickens?" Mabel asked. "She cried at Little Dorrit," he said. "Every time she read it 3 times. "I cried at Little Dorrit," Mabel said. "Most people do," he said. "That is what he earns it with." They rode out past the south pasture where the cattle grazed in the late heat, and the sky went orange and then red, and then the first stars appeared. And they turned back toward the ranch and Frank talked about the land, about what his father had started and what he had built and what he hoped Sophie would have one day. And Mabel listened with all of herself, not just the polite surface of her attention, but the deep attending that she gave to things that mattered. One evening in late August, returning from one of these rides, Frank helped her down from the gray as he always did. And this time when she stepped down, he did not immediately step back, and she did not immediately step forward, and they stood very close in the late evening air with the horses standing patiently behind them, and the light from the ranch house warm in the windows. And Frank looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded for the first time since she had known him. "Mabel," he said, and the words sounded different in his voice, heavier with care. "Yes," she said, and she was not sure whether she was answering him or simply agreeing to whatever it was. He lifted his hand and very carefully tucked a strand of her hair back from where it had come loose from its arrangement. Just that. Nothing more. His fingers barely grazed her temple, and then he stepped back and cleared his throat and said she should get inside before the mosquitoes got bad, which was such an abrupt return to practical territory that she almost laughed. But she did not laugh. She said good night very composedly, and went inside and sat on her bed in the dark for a long time with her hand against her temple where his fingers had brushed. She told no one about this. Edna, who had the instincts of a hound for this sort of thing, gave her a series of significant looks over breakfast, and Mabel ignored all of them with tremendous patience. September came, and with it the first cool edges in the evening air, and a traveling preacher who came through Dustwood on his circuit and held a service in the town hall that half the town attended. Mabel went because it seemed the reasonable thing to do, and Frank was there with Sophie, sitting 3 rows ahead of her, and she had the opportunity to look at the back of his head for 45 minutes, which told her nothing useful but which she found herself doing anyway. After the service, people gathered outside in the pleasant evening air, and there were cups of lemonade that someone had organized, and the occasion had a loose, social quality that Mabel had come to associate with Dustwood at its best, people simply being in the same place together without particular agenda. Frank found her at the edge of the gathering, which she thought was probably not accidental on either of their parts. "Good service," she said. "Better than the last preacher who came through," Frank said. "That man had a theory about the book of Job that went on for 2 hours. 2 hours, Mabel said. "I have nothing against Job," Frank said. "But 2 hours is a long time to spend with any man suffering." She looked at him. "Even your own." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the directness that she had come to understand was how he said the things that mattered most, "especially your own." They looked at each other in the lantern light of the town hall porch, and Sophie came running up to announce that Billy Harlow had gotten lemonade on his good shirt, and wasn't that something? And the moment broke into the normal river of the evening, but Mabel carried it home with her and slept with it close, like something warm against the cooling nights. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning in October that changed everything. Mabel was teaching the older children, Sophie and Billy, and the 4 others aged 8 to 12, a lesson about measurement. She had brought in a length of rope and was having them measure things around the schoolroom, which was going well until Billy Harlow, who was measuring the height of the door frame and trying to hold the rope at the top with one hand, while reading the bottom with the other and simultaneously announcing his findings to the room, miscalculated, lost his grip, and the rope snaked down and wrapped itself around his ankle, and Billy sat down on the floor with considerable drama. Mabel went to help him up, took the rope, and in the process of untangling him from it, managed to get the far end looped over her own shoulder in a way that she could not immediately see and therefore could not immediately fix. She straightened up, looked at the rope going over her shoulder and under her arm and back around to Billy's ankle, and said, with great sincerity, "I appear to have measured myself." There was a beat of silence. The children looked at her. She looked at them. And then from the back of the room, where Frank Graves had appeared in the open doorway. He had come early to collect Sophie and had been standing in the doorway perhaps 30 seconds before the rope incident reached its conclusion. There came a sound. It started as something strangled, something he was clearly trying to contain, and then it came apart at the seams, and what emerged was the most remarkable thing Mabel had heard since coming to Dustwood. It was a laugh. Not a polite exhale, not a quiet sound of amusement, but a real laugh, deep and full and helpless and clearly shocking even to himself, because she could hear him trying to stop it and failing completely. Everyone in the room turned around. Frank Graves was standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse with his hat in his hand and his face completely undone, laughing the way a person laughs when they have been holding themselves very carefully for a very long time, and something small and ridiculous slips through every single defense at once. He was laughing with his whole chest. He pressed his fist to his mouth trying to stop it, and that only made it worse. Mabel stood very still with the rope over her shoulder and felt something so full and so tender it almost hurt. She watched him, this man who had not laughed in years, she knew it. She had known it since Edna told her about the crack of thunder on a summer night, and she watched him laugh now, helpless and astonished by himself, and she felt it like a door opening in a room that had been sealed for too long. The children were giggling now, and Billy Harlow was laughing too, and Sophie was looking at her father with the most enormous, careful joy on her face, like someone watching a miracle they had been hoping for without quite daring to believe in. Frank finally got himself under something approaching control, but he was still shaking slightly and his eyes were bright and there was color in his face, and he looked at Mabel with an expression that was completely naked, completely present, no distance, no reserve, nothing held back, and he said, "Do that again." "I beg your pardon," Mabel said. "Whatever you just did," he said, "do it again." "I do not believe I can recreate it on demand," she said very seriously. "It required both Billy's incompetence and my own to achieve." He laughed again, less helpless this time but just as real, just as full, and rubbed his hand over his face and looked at her with those gray eyes that were so different right now, so present and alive, and Mabel's heart turned over entirely. Sophie ran to her father and he picked her up, which she was almost too old for but which neither of them cared about, and she hugged him around the neck, and he held her close and looked at Mabel over his daughter's shoulder with an expression that said everything that 3 years of grief had kept him from being able to say. And Mabel stood in the schoolhouse with a rope over her shoulder and her heart entirely full. The children were released at the appropriate time, and they filed out chattering, and then it was just Frank and Sophie and Mabel, and Sophie very pointedly announced that she was going to go check on Mr. Purvis's cat, who had had kittens last week, and could she please go? And Frank let her go with the full knowledge that his daughter had engineered this exit with great intention. He came into the schoolroom properly then, the door open behind him, the October afternoon warm and golden. He stood with his hat in his hands and looked at her, and they were quiet together for a moment that had the quality of something that could go in several directions. "I have not done that in a long time," he said. "I know," she said. "I did not know I missed it. People forget to miss things that have been gone long enough," she said gently. He turned the hat in his hands. "Mabel, yes. I would like to take you for supper," he said. "Not a ride, not with Sophie. I mean," he stopped, started again. "I would like to take you for supper as something that is a different kind of asking than teaching Sophie arithmetic." She looked at him steadily. "Are you asking me to court you, Mr. Graves, or are you asking me to court you?" The corner of his mouth pulled. "I am asking you to have supper with me, in town, this Saturday, and to allow that it might lead to whatever it leads to." "I would like that very much," Mabel said. "Frank," he smiled. It was the first real, full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up, made him look younger and more himself than he had ever appeared in the 8 months she had known him. It was, she thought, the most handsome face she had ever looked at. "Good," he said, and put his hat on and went to collect Sophie from the kittens. Mabel waited until she heard his horse moving away down the road, and then she sat down on the nearest bench and said, to no one in particular, "Well." Then she got up, put on her coat, and walked back to the boarding house in the golden October afternoon, and she was smiling so much that 3 separate townspeople who saw her on the street mentioned it later. Edna met her at the door with the expression of a woman who has been right about something for a very long time. "Well," she said. "We are having supper on Saturday," Mabel said. Edna pressed her hands together like a satisfied verdict. "I told everyone it would be before Christmas," she said. "You were betting on us," Mabel said. "Mabel, honey," Edna said, "this whole town has been betting on you too since June." Supper on Saturday was at the Dustwood Hotel dining room, which was the most formal establishment in town, and which served reasonable roast beef and very good pie, and which gave the occasion enough ceremony that it felt like what it was, a beginning that both of them had decided to take seriously. Frank wore his good coat. Mabel wore the blue dress. They sat across the table from each other with the candlelight between them and talked for 3 hours straight, the way 2 people talk when they have been circling a conversation for months and have finally been given permission to go directly to it. He told her about his father, who had come from Tennessee with nothing except a land grant and the certainty that he could build something. He told her about the years building the ranch, the dry years and the wet years, and the year the cattle fever came through and what they had nearly lost. He told her about meeting Clara at a dance in a town 40 miles south, about how she had laughed at something he said, a real laugh, not a polite one, and he had known immediately that she was someone he needed to know for the rest of his life. Mabel told him about Abilene, about her father who was a retired schoolteacher himself and who had filled the house with books after her mother died. She told him about the year's teaching, the things that had been good about it, and the things that had made her feel she was slowly running out of whatever it was she had come with. She told him about the day she had seen the advertisement in the paper and had felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was not comfort and not familiar, and that made her feel alive. He listened to all of it with his full attention, and she understood then why Sophie had started to flourish. This was what it felt like when Frank Graves paid attention to you, like being the only thing in the room that mattered, like being genuinely known. By the time they walked out of the hotel into the October night, the street was quiet and the stars were out in their extravagance and the air was cool and sharp and perfect. He offered her his arm walking to the boarding house, and she took it, and they walked slowly because neither of them wanted to be at the end of the walk. At the boarding house gate he turned to face her, and in the dark his eyes were quiet and serious and warm all at once. "Mabel," he said, "I want you to know that he paused. I have been a long time in a very small space, and you have made that space larger. I don't entirely know how you did it." "I measured myself with a rope," she said, and his face broke open in that smile again, the real one, and she thought she could spend the rest of her life making him smile like that and not feel she had wasted a day. He bent down and kissed her, gentle and certain, just once, and when he stepped back he looked at her with an expression that had nothing held back in it at all. "Good night, Mabel," he said. "Good night, Frank," she said, and went inside and leaned against the closed door in the dark hallway and felt entirely and completely like herself. The courtship that followed had all the qualities of something that had been a long time in the building and was now going up fast. They were not young people being cautious. Frank was 34 and Mabel was 26, and they had both spent enough time living to know the difference between what was real and what was not. What was between them was real, and they both knew it, and having acknowledged it, they did not see any reason to pretend otherwise. He came to supper at the boarding house twice a week, because Edna, who had taken full credit for the relationship and accepted congratulations for it in the manner of someone who had personally engineered it, set a place for him as a matter of course. They continued to ride on Thursdays, and now Mabel was actually riding rather than simply surviving a horse at a slow walk, and Frank taught her with the same patience and specific attention he gave to everything he cared about. And by the end of October, she could canter without hanging on with both hands, which Frank said was the mark of a real rider, and which Sophie said was pretty good for a teacher. Sophie had taken to Mabel in the way that a child takes to someone who loves them correctly, openly and without reservation, with a trust that knew its own business and did not need permission. She began calling Mabel Miss Brooks at school and Mabel everywhere else, and Mabel understood the distinction perfectly and honored both of them. Frank asked her one evening in November, very directly, whether she intended to stay in Dustwood past the school year. "Why?" she asked. "Because the school board renews contracts in December," he said, "and I want to know whether to speak to them." She looked at him. "Are you asking whether I intend to stay, or are you asking me to stay?" "Both," he said. "Then yes," she said, "to both." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat together in the cooling evening on the front porch of his ranch house, watching the last light go out of the western sky, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it. November in Dustwood had a particular quality, the light going silver and the mesquite going rust gold, and the far distance of the horizon taking on that deep blue-gray that meant the season was changing. Mabel had come to love Texas in spite of herself, which she suspected Texas had intended all along. She loved the scale of it, the way the sky was bigger here than anywhere she had been, the way the land had a frankness to it, no pretension, just what it was, going on as far as you could see and then beyond. She loved the people of Dustwood, who were imperfect and familiar, and who had taken her in with the rough warmth of people who understand that community is not a luxury in a place like this but a practical necessity, and who had transformed that necessity into something genuine. She loved Rosa Salinas, who brought her food when she was tired and told her things straight. She loved old Mrs. Reyes at the ranch, who had begun to speak to her in Spanish and to correct her pronunciation with a patience that suggested high expectations. She loved Billy Harlow, who would be a man of considerable capability someday if he could only stay reliably on his feet. And she loved Frank Graves with a completeness that she had not been looking for, and that she found she had no desire to argue with anymore. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday evening in late November, as they were coming back from a ride in the early dark of the shortened days. He had not planned a grand gesture. This was not a man who planned grand gestures, but he had thought about it very carefully, and he had something to say, which he said standing in the yard of his ranch with his hat in his hands, and the stars coming out overhead in patience, and the gray standing at the fence post behind them because they knew this yard meant food was coming. "I was not a complete man for a long time," he said. "I functioned and I did what was needed and I loved Sophie and I kept the land going, but I was not," he stopped. "Something was put out, and I had gotten used to it being out and I had stopped thinking about lighting it again." "And you walked into the horse trough on your first day in Dustwood and you looked at everyone looking at you and you wrung out your hat and kept walking, and every week since then you have." He stopped again and looked at the ground and then back at her, and in the near dark his gray eyes were very clear. "You gave me my laugh back," he said quietly. "You do not know how much that is." "I think I know," she said. "Will you marry me, Mabel?" he said. "Will you stay here? Not just this year and the next, but here in this house, with Sophie and with me for as long as there is." She did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Frank, yes." He pulled her close and held her with both arms, and she could feel the tension go out of him, 3 years of it, like something that had been waiting for permission to leave. She held on to him in the cold dark and felt him breathe. "You are going to have to tell Sophie," she said eventually, from somewhere in the front of his coat. "She knows," he said. "She knows. She told me to ask you a month ago," he said. "She said I was taking too long." Mabel laughed against his chest, and felt his laugh come back up through him in response, warm and real and present. They announced the engagement at supper at the boarding house the following week, which was not much of an announcement because Edna had already told half the town on the reasonable grounds that she had known it was coming. The mayor sent his congratulations. Hector Salinas shook Frank's hand with the grip of a man who meant it. Rosa Salinas made tamales specifically for the occasion and told Mabel she was a sensible woman, which from Rosa was a significant tribute. Sophie, when formally told, responded by making a drawing of a house with 3 people standing in front of it, which she gave to Mabel with the serious expression of someone presenting a legal document. The 3 people were identified by their heights, not their faces, one very tall, one medium, one short, and they were standing with their shoulders touching. Mabel put it on the wall above her desk in the schoolhouse, where it stayed. They were married in January of 1883, at the town hall of Dustwood on a cold, bright winter day when the sky was the color of blue glass, and the mesquite was bare and skeletal and beautiful against it. Mabel wore a cream-colored dress that Rosa Salinas had helped her alter because neither of them had the patience to order anything from a catalog, and it fit perfectly. Frank wore his good suit, which Mrs. Reyes had pressed so severely that the creases could have drawn lines, and he looked, Sophie told him, exactly right. The preacher was the same circuit preacher who had come through in September, which Frank had specifically arranged because Mabel had mentioned she liked the way the man gave a service without making the occasion into a performance. The vows were the traditional words, and the words were true, and when Frank said them in his quiet, even voice, looking at Mabel with the full, steady attention she had come to understand was his truest expression, she felt them land in her with the weight of things meant. Dustwood turned out for the reception the way Dustwood turned out for things with enthusiasm and food and music from Collins on the fiddle, and this time Frank danced. He took Mabel's hand and they danced 3 reels together, and she was clumsy at it in the most excellent way, and he guided her through it with both hands and a patience that had her laughing until she was breathless. And he laughed with her, and everyone who was there, and who had known Frank Graves for longer than Mabel had watched them, and felt something complicated and grateful in their chests. Sophie danced with Billy Harlow, who was a better dancer than his general coordination suggested, and then she danced with her father, and then she stood at the edge of the floor and watched her father and Mabel dancing together in the bright gold light of the lanterns, and her face had on it an expression that Mabel would remember for the rest of her life. Moving into the ranch house was a different kind of beginning, the practical, intimate one that follows the ceremony. Mabel brought her books and her teaching materials and the rope that had started everything, which she had kept, because it seemed important to keep it, and Frank helped her find places for everything with a willingness to rearrange that suggested he understood. He was not simply making room for objects. Sophie helped design the arrangement of Mabel's books, which led to a dispute about whether books should be organized by subject or by the author's name, which led to a three-way conversation that went on through supper and part of the evening, and was eventually resolved by a compromise system that neither of them could entirely explain to anyone else, but which worked perfectly for the three of them. Mrs. Reyes began teaching Mabel to cook things she did not know how to cook, which was most things that were good in the world, and Mabel was an eager student and a surprisingly capable one. And there was a period of experimentation in the kitchen that Frank endured with the good humor of a man who understood the stakes and was willing to pay them. Spring came again, and the mesquite bloomed again, and the school started its second year with Mabel at the front and 14 children instead of 12, because 2 families had come to Dustwood over the winter. Billy Harlow was in his last year and growing so fast he had to sit at the older bench, because his legs would not fit under the smaller one, and Sophie was in the middle of the class now, and had begun helping the younger children with their reading in a way that suggested she might be a teacher herself someday. Mabel taught her school and came home to the ranch in the afternoons, and in the evenings she and Frank sat on the porch with the last of the day's light and talked about everything and nothing, and she thought that this was it. This was the whole of what she had wanted without knowing how to name it. Not adventure, not safety, but the specific and irreplaceable thing that was this man and this place and this life. In April, she told Frank that she thought she was expecting. He was standing at the kitchen table reading the week's paper, which arrived on the stage from the county seat, and she set down the dish she was drying and said it plainly, the way she said most things. He looked up at her from the paper, and for a moment he was very still, and then he got up and came around the table and took her face in both hands and looked at her with an expression that was so open and so much that she almost had to look away. "Are you certain?" he said. "As certain as one can be at this point," she said. He kissed her forehead, her temple, her cheek. "Good," he said very quietly. "Good." Sophie, told 2 days later with Frank on one side and Mabel on the other at the supper table, looked between them with 8-year-old seriousness and said, "Is it a brother or a sister?" "We do not know yet," Mabel said. "I would prefer a brother," Sophie said. "Billy Harlow has 3 sisters and he says it is complicated." "I will take that under advisement," Mabel said. Frank, across the table, was looking at both of them with an expression that made him look entirely like the man Edna Clary had described, the one who had laughed like a crack of thunder on a summer night, the one who had made everyone around him feel like things were going to be all right. He was that man again. He had been finding his way back to that man since the day a woman had walked out of a horse trough with her hat on straight, and he was all the way there now, or near enough that the remaining distance felt like something that would close on its own. The summer of 1883 moved through Dustwood warm and good. Mabel continued teaching through June and then handed the school over to a temporary teacher for the fall term, an arrangement the school board made with some reluctance, and which she accepted on the condition that they keep her position, which they agreed to because they were not foolish enough to risk losing her permanently. Frank hovered, which she had not expected of him. He was a self-contained man who gave others room, and she had not anticipated being watched quite so carefully. But he managed it with enough subtlety that she could pretend she did not notice most of the time. He asked about her health without making a production of it. He rode into town with her when she had appointments with Dr. Marsh, the physician who had come to Dustwood the previous winter. He built a second bookshelf in the bedroom because she had run out of room and she was reading more now in the evenings. "You don't have to build things every time you're worried," she told him. "I know," he said, and built the bookshelf anyway. In late November, as the first cold settled on the land and the south pasture cattle moved closer to the winter feed ground, Mabel gave birth to a boy. He was born in the large front bedroom of the ranch house with Dr. Marsh attending and Mrs. Ray's outside the door saying prayers in Spanish and Sophie sitting on the kitchen bench holding Frank's hand with a grip that was considerably stronger than her size suggested. Frank was allowed in at the end, and he came through the door and crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was red and furious and very much in the world, and then at Mabel, who was tired and magnificent, and he had nothing to say for a long moment. "He has your stubbornness," Frank said finally. "He has been here 12 minutes, Mabel said. "You cannot tell that yet." "He has your stubbornness," Frank said again with certainty. She laughed, tired and genuine, and he leaned over and kissed her hair. They named him James. James Graves, after Frank's father, which Frank proposed and Mabel accepted with the immediate recognition that it was exactly right. He was James from the first moment, and he was loud about it, which he would continue to be for the foreseeable future. Sophie was brought in to see him, and she sat very carefully on the edge of the bed beside Mabel and held James with the focused seriousness of someone who understood they were holding something important. She looked at him for a long time and then looked up at Mabel. "He is very small," she said. "He will not always be," Mabel said. "That is good," Sophie said, "because otherwise he will not be much use." James, unaware of being assessed, grasped her finger. Sophie's face went entirely quiet and entirely certain. "All right," she said. "He can stay." The months after James arrived were full and hard and entirely wonderful in the particular way of a life that has become too full to carry alone and has people to help carry it. Mrs. Ray's, who had been thinking about going to live with her daughter in El Paso, decided firmly to stay. Edna Clary came out to the ranch on a Saturday with a basket of food and an opinion on how the baby was being held, which she delivered with great conviction and which Mabel accepted with enormous grace. Rosa Salinas sent tamales. Billy Harlow, who was now doing full ranch work for his father, stopped in one afternoon and stood in the doorway looking at the baby with the expression of a young man encountering something genuinely outside his experience. "He is very loud," Billy said. "He is," Mabel agreed. "Is he always like that?" "Yes," she said. Billy said, with the air of a person filing this information for future reference, and left. Frank was magnificent with James, in the straightforward way of a man who had done this before and knew what was needed. He walked him in the night without complaint, and he held him in the crook of his arm while doing things one-handed in a way that suggested considerable practice, and he spoke to him the same way he had spoken to Sophie, directly, quietly, with full attention, as though James were already a person with views worth considering, which James, in fairness, seemed to find correct. Sophie showed him the horses through the fence before he could walk, holding him on her hip and naming each one. She read to him from the primers when he was old enough to be propped up and interested, and James looked at her with the enormous attentiveness of a baby who has located someone who will pay him this kind of regard and intends to hold on to it. Mabel returned to teaching in the spring of 1884, when James was 4 months old, and Mrs. Ray's had made clear that she was perfectly capable of managing a 4-month-old and possibly even 2 or 3. Thank you very much. The school had 13 children by then, because the town was growing, and Mabel stood at the front of the room on the first morning back and felt the particular satisfaction of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. She was not only a teacher in Dustwood anymore. She had become, with the quiet, organic inevitability of someone who turns up and does things and cares about the outcome, a person the town came to. When the school board needed to make decisions about the curriculum, they asked her. When the question of the library, a proper library, small but real, came before the town council, she was the one who had prepared the argument and who stood before Aldous Fenwick and his magnificent white mustache and made the case. She ordered books from St. Louis the way Clara had, catalogs spread across the kitchen table on winter evenings, and Frank would come and sit beside her, and she would read him descriptions of titles, and he would say yes or no with the same authority he applied to cattle decisions, and she would add the yeses to her order. The library opened in a converted room at the back of the general store in the fall of 1884, with 14 chairs and 232 books, and a sign that Mabel painted herself that said DUSTWOOD, Free Lending Library, in letters that were even and deliberate. Frank came to the opening and stood with James on his hip. James had learned to walk but still preferred being carried by his father, which Frank permitted because children were small for such a short time, and looked at everything she had done and said, "Clara would have loved this place." "I know," Mabel said. "I thought about her when I was ordering the books." He looked at her steadily for a moment, and then he shifted James to his other hip and put his free arm around her shoulder, and they stood together in the little library with all those books around them, and the whole town milling in and out, and James trying to eat the corner of a volume of Tennyson that Mabel removed from his reach with practiced ease. The territory of Texas moved into 1885 and the years after with the ordinary business of lives that are going well, which is to say they were full and sometimes difficult and always real. The cattle operation grew as Frank took on a second hand and expanded the south pasture. Sophie grew up and into herself, becoming at 12 a girl of such clear opinions and such direct capability that she alarmed some people and delighted everyone who understood what they were looking at. She was going to be someone who mattered, in the specific and rare way of people who combine intelligence with the willingness to use it for things bigger than themselves. James at 2 was exactly as Mabel had predicted, determined to the point of stubbornness, interested in everything, and deeply certain that his views on every subject were correct. He had Frank's steady gray eyes and Mabel's tendency to say exactly what he thought, which was a combination that Sophie described with some feeling as a lot to manage. Frank had laughed at that. He laughed regularly now, not always at the big things, sometimes at the small ones, sometimes at himself, which was the kind of laughter that Mabel had been most glad to find in him. He had given himself back fully, and the man Edna Clary had described, the one who made everyone feel like things were going to be all right, was present in the house and on the ranch, and in the town of Dustwood on a daily basis. And those who had known him in the years of his grief looked at him now with the particular gratitude people feel when someone they love has come home. On a Thursday evening in October 1885, almost exactly 3 years from the Thursday that Frank had come to the school and heard Mabel announce that she had measured herself, they sat on the porch of the ranch house in the warm last of the day. James was asleep inside, finally conquered by the afternoon. Sophie was in her room writing something, either a letter or one of the stories she had started composing, and which she kept in a box under her bed. Mrs. Reyes had gone home for the evening. It was quiet in the specific way that the ranch was quiet after days full of work and people, and the general production of a running life, a quality of quiet that felt like something earned. The mesquite was gold in the late light, and the south pasture cattle were dark shapes in the middle distance, and the sky was going from orange to rose to the first transparent blue of evening. Mabel leaned her head on Frank's shoulder and he put his arm around her, the way they always sat on this porch. "I was thinking," she said, "about the horse trough." He made a sound of acknowledgement. "I have decided," she said, "that it was the best thing that has ever happened to me." He turned his head and looked down at her with the full attention she had never gotten tired of receiving. "Because it got my coat wet," he said. "Your coat was nowhere near the trough," she said. "You were leaning against the store being indifferent to the whole world." "I was not indifferent to you," he said, and the directness of it still had the power to catch her precisely in the center of herself. "I was trying to be." "How was that going?" "Poorly," he said, "right from the start." She smiled against his shoulder. "Good," she said. He kissed the top of her head, and the last light went gold on the pasture, and the first star appeared above the line of mesquite, and the ordinary extraordinary evening settled around them like something given freely, like something they had built together out of grief and stubbornness, and a rope someone had gotten tangled in, and the specific, irreplaceable music of a man's laugh finding its way back into the world. Inside the house, James woke from his nap and said something unintelligible but emphatic, which was his manner. Sophie called out from her room in a sisterly tone, suggesting he should go back to sleep. James responded with the certainty of a child who has identified an audience. Frank and Mabel listened to this from the porch and looked at each other in the near dark, and Frank's face opened into that full, real, thundercrack smile, and Mabel thought, as she always thought when she saw it, that she would gladly measure herself with a rope every day for the rest of her life if it would keep that smile on his face. "I should go in," Frank said. "In a moment," she said, and he stayed, and the evening was warm and full and good, and the stars came out one at a time above the Texas plain like a slow, deliberate accounting of everything that was present in the world, everything known and living and right. Years later, when Sophie was grown and studying in a proper city school and writing letters home that were longer and more articulate than anything Mabel had managed at her age, and James was 6 and 7 and 8, and full of the specific chaos of being a boy with opinions, and the Graves Ranch had become a settled and recognized thing in the landscape of that part of Texas, people who knew the story, and many people in Dustwood knew the story, because towns of that size do not let good stories go, would sometimes say to each other, across a table or a fence or a counter, that Frank Graves had changed when the schoolteacher came. And those who knew it best would correct them gently in the way of people who want the precise truth told. They would say it was not that Frank Graves had changed. It was that a woman had arrived and made a fool of herself in a horse trough, and then looked straight at the most closed-off man in the county and said, "Well, that was a fine introduction," and then proceeded, week by week and Thursday by Thursday and one ridiculous moment at a time, to make it true. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, in a schoolroom, with a length of rope, in the middle of a lesson about measurement, something had cracked open in the best way a thing can crack, and a laugh had come out of Frank Graves that he had been keeping somewhere too dark and too long, and it had moved through the room like light coming through a door someone has finally decided to open, and the world on the other side had been exactly what it was supposed to be. Frank and Mabel Graves grew old in that house on the Texas plain, with the mesquite changing its colors season to season, and the cattle moving across the south pasture, and the stars doing their faithful work above all of it. They had one more child, a girl they named Clara, who had her grandmother's name and her father's steady eyes and her mother's absolute certainty about her own views, and who turned out to be precisely as much trouble and delight as this combination suggested. And every year, on some ordinary evening when nothing particular was happening, one of them would say something a little foolish at exactly the wrong moment. This happened regularly, in a household of that composition, and Frank would laugh, and Mabel would hear it, and she would feel it in the same place she had felt it the first time, like a door opening in a room where it has always been too dark. And he would look at her, and she would look back, and between them was everything they had made together, the school and the library and the ranch and the children and the years of honest conversation and the Thursdays and the rope and the horse trough and the long ride home through the Texas evening. And none of it had been lost, and none of it had been wasted, and all of it had been, from the very first moment, exactly enough.